Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I am your host, Kyle. Sorry I've been away for a little bit. I've been busy the last couple of weeks. I went to a wedding, had a surprise birthday party thrown for me, and I went to the Renaissance Fair, so I've generally been pretty busy. But I am back, though a little bit of news on that. I've been doing this for a little while now, and I really enjoy making this show, but it takes a lot of time, and it's not the only thing that I do. So, I'll be upfront with y'all. The schedule is going to be pretty loosey-goosey going forwards. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know how that all is going to play out, but we're going to kind of figure it out together. But anyways, I am back, and today we are going to be talking about something that I think is really cool, and I think you guys will too. Today, we're going to be talking about the Night Witches. Yeah. What the fuck is a Night Witch, you might be thinking? Well, let me tell you. To start our story, we need to start with a little bit of background. Russia and the Soviet Union have an interesting history with allowing women into their armed forces. The Russian Empire famously created what were known as the Battalions of Death, most famously Botchkareva's Battalion of Death, which was an all-women's battalion that was created to try and shame men into serving in World War I. The thought was that the men would see, oh no, their women are going off to war, and then they'd feel guilty and unmanly, and then suddenly decide, no, I need to take up arms and defend the motherland, and that they would then run off to prove their manliness and keep their women out of the war. In reality, that didn't really happen. And this battalion, though, they really did go see combat. And it was really, really rough for them. They got chewed up bad. I will probably do an episode on them later because they're an interesting group of people as well. But for now, I mainly need you to know that the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union have somewhat of a history of sending women into combat. This point here in World War I was a pretty clear inflection point on Russian and then later Soviet society, especially because at that time things were really up in the air, and then the Soviet Union, when they ultimately took over most of what was the Russian Empire, they were, at least on paper, committed to, as they put it, the equality of the sexes. During the interwar periods, women were allowed into lots of different jobs, industries, and institutions that were generally reserved for men. Technically, the army was one of these institutions. Again, at least on paper. But when women tried to join up, they often ran into some issues. You see, the Soviet Union, like any country that has a political or ideological linchpin, had some issues with said ideology. There were many who really did believe in the ideas of the revolution and the goal of a more perfect Soviet socialist nation. In this instance, this would be a lot of women who wanted to join the army, that they were interested in serving their country and, doing all the things that men generally were doing. They were told that sexism and discrimination were capitalist, bourgeois ideals, and that there was no place for any of that in the Red Army. But then, there is the issue that just because liberty and justice for all is in the pledge, doesn't mean that it actually happens. What I mean by that is that although the Soviet government stated, and some believe truly, that men and women were equal in the eyes of the state, that was just objectively not the case. Although it was strictly illegal for women to be denied a place in the army, it happened quite frequently. Often this would take the form of recruiters turning women away from combat positions and trying to talk them into joining up with the nursing corps or maybe logistics or something else, something away from the actual, shooty bits. But many women didn't want to be nurses. A good number of them wanted to be proper shoot the bad guy type soldiers. So, where there's a will, there's a way. And the way manifests in what were called training clubs. An interesting thing people probably don't think about when they think of the Soviet Union was that the USSR actually really wanted their folks to be good with guns and to get experience with military hardware. A lot of us Americans really think that this is kind of an American thing. This is what so many of us hoot and holler about with the Second Amendment, right? We have a whole militia movement here that loves to pat itself on the back and say how it would defend the nation from anything from a foreign invader to a man wearing fishnets having brunch. So it may be somewhat of a surprise that a lot of Soviet citizens actually did get paramilitary training and hands-on experience with military equipment and military doctrine. One of the most popular iterations of these clubs were flight clubs. Yup, you heard me right, flight clubs. Now, to be fair, this is the 1920s, 30s, and the very, opening months of the 1940s. So, flying's a hell of a lot different then than it is now. Nowadays, to be a pilot in the military, you have to be an officer, and you have to have years and years and years of training, and you're going to go in these kind of fancy, simulators and all this kind of stuff. And to be fair, you're going to have to fly a lot of the kinds of planes, or at least something similar to the kinds of planes they flew back then for their actual jobs in training today. So it was a lot easier to train pilots. And also, there were a lot of people who would have non-pilot jobs, things like gunners on a bomber, or radio technicians, or all of that kind of stuff. I kind of digress. Either way, these flying clubs were really popular, and they were all over the USSR. And a lot of these, actually really all of them, were run by the government, and their goal was to teach people how to fly airplanes. The plan was that in any kind of war or national emergency, the country would be able to quickly draw upon a swath of already trained pilots who could just be given a plane and shoved into combat. A good number of women joined these flying clubs. On the one hand, some did it just because they wanted to do flying and it was kind of a in vogue thing at the time, but also a lot of them did this out of a genuine patriotic desire to serve their country. I want to take a moment here to say, yes, that did happen. Here in the US especially, but I imagine throughout much of the rest of the world, particularly the kind of, quote-unquote Western world, a lot of people think, oh yeah, no, the Soviet Union was horrible and terrible and everybody hated it. I'm not going to sit here and sing the praises of the Soviet Union. You're never going to catch me doing that. But there were a lot of people who really genuinely did believe in it, and it was their homeland. And, well, something that I imagine a lot of people, especially here in the US, can kind of vibe with is you may still love your country, even if it's not doing things that you like. But anyhow, one of these women was a lady named Marina Raskova. Marina Raskova was a fucking rock star. Here in the States, we have Amelia Earhart. In the USSR, they had Raskova. Raskova was a commissioned officer in the Red Army. A major, to be precise. And she was a pilot. And a pretty damn good one by all accounts. Marina became famous when she and two other women, who received commissions with the Red Army as well, broke the continuous flying record in their airplane named the Rodina, which means motherland in Russia. They made a 26-hour, non-stop, continuous flight, which, that sounds miserable, but the three of them did it. But like I said, there were three of them. What made Raskova so famous, as opposed to the other two, was that she ultimately had to bail out of the Rodina and spend 10 days alone in the Russian wilderness, and she survived out there. When she was found, the Russian people went absolutely gaga for her. One of these said gaga people was a certain Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. After her exploits and meteoric rise to fame, Stalin became close with Raskova. He personally invited her to dinner and spent a lot of time talking about Raskova in the press to just about anyone who would listen. This was for two reasons. One, he really seemed to genuinely like her. And two, he liked using her as a prop to show that the USSR had defeated sexism and created a post-sexist state. But this, of course, was not really the case. The Soviet Union was still very much so a patriarchal society. They were definitely more open than the incredibly rigid, societally patriarchal Russian Empire that came before it, but it's still very much so these are women's jobs and these are men's jobs, and they do not cross. So somebody like Raskova, well, you could kind of just trump her up and say, hey, look, we did it. And that's exactly what Stalin did. But then things started to kind of change when World War II kicked off. When the Second World War began, there were almost no women in the Red Army. But this would soon change. Much like their male counterparts, women flocked in huge numbers to enlist and defend their homeland from the Nazi invaders. A lot of these women were members of the various training clubs that we discussed previously. Seemingly, the system was working as intended. And in some ways it was. Men who were trained in soldiering and flying were pretty immediately shipped off to the front to fill in the gaps to stop the invasion. And even some women were sent off to serve in infantry, nursing, other kind of non-combat or limited combat roles. Though, to be fair, a good number did go to frontline infantry positions, which, at this point, yeah, they were seeing some shit. But as far as pilots were concerned, there was no such luck. The Soviet government and the Red Army were clear. No women pilots. But the women of the Soviet Union weren't going to take that lying down. In particular, one woman in the Soviet Union was definitely not taking that. And that would be Major Marina Raskova. Along with a nationwide letter-writing campaign, Raskova put pressure on the Soviet government, and on Stalin personally, to allow women to serve in the Soviet Air Force. At first, there was little traction for this, but things started to kind of spiral pretty quickly. You see, the Nazis weren't stopping. In fact, they weren't even really slowing down. The Soviet Union was taking massive losses, and their Air Force had taken some pretty debilitating hits, as Stalin, before the war, had forbid the Soviet Union for preparing for a war. And so, when the Nazis did ultimately invade, basically the entire Soviet Air Force was not prepared for it. So when the Nazis came in, most of the planes were not in bunkers or away from the front or in any way prepared. They were just sitting there, out in the open at their airfields, nice and easy targets for the Nazis to blow up. In the opening months of World War II, Russia lost something like 3/4 of its entire air force. So, with casualties mounting and replacements becoming fewer and farther between, Stalin and the Red Army ultimately gave in to the demands of the Soviet women who were hell-bent on serving on the front. A little less than a year after the war began, Marina Raskova was given permission to create the 122nd Composite Air Group. Within this air group, there would be 3 regiments, the most famous of which would be the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, who we're going to be talking about today. As I said, the 588th was one of 3 regiments that made up the 122nd Composite Air Group, and was the only one that would remain made up entirely of women throughout the entire war, and would easily become the most famous. You see, the 122nd Composite Air Group originally was an entirely women's-only organization. But as the war continued, particularly the other 2 regiments, they took a lot of losses. And well, when that happened, they needed replacements. And they couldn't be particularly picky. So they stopped being entirely women and became co-ed. The 588th never did. But despite its auspicious heights, the 588th would start off rough and tumble. Incredibly so, in fact. To start, Raskova hand-selected the women that joined her air group. To make it into the group was no small feat, as you had to prove to Raskova personally that you were a skilled and dedicated pilot. If you were not found to be fit for piloting, you would be relegated to a support position. And when I say relegated, I'm not saying that as if to imply there's something wrong with those positions, but to the women, there sure as hell was. To be a pilot, especially a fighter pilot, was a highly coveted position, and these women worked their fucking asses off to get there. Unfortunately, the 588th were not fighter pilots. They were bombers, and they were night bombers at that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but long story short, night bombers were generally not the best pilots, they generally didn't have the best crews, and they were generally not given the best equipment. They were also not really seen as being as kind of good as the fighter pilots. But whatever else can be said about the 588th, they were there. They were on the board. They impressed Raskova enough to get shipped off to her grueling airplane boot camp from hell. Once in Raskova's air group, the women were shipped off by train to the Engels Air Force Base. There, the women underwent 12 to 16 hours a day of harsh training overseen by Raskova herself. And at night, Raskova would come wake the women up to check their readiness. The standard was that every single one of them would have to wake up, get dressed, and get to work in 5 minutes or less. And that was on the nights when they weren't training. Otherwise, they'd be practicing night flying. Night flying was actually something that Raskova put a lot of emphasis on because it was something that was not taught in the civilian air clubs. So, these ladies did not sleep much at all. The training tempo was, in a word, intense. All of these women were familiar with the planes that they were using and some of the norms of the military from their experiences in the flight clubs, but there was still a lot to learn. Raskova's plan was to shove about 3 years' worth of in-depth military training into 6 months. And once those 6 months were up, the various regiments that made up the 122nd Air Group were shipped off to their duty stations. The 588th, for their part, were attached to the 218th Night Bomber Regiment, which was commanded by one D.D. Popov. When the 588th arrived, Popov was, let's say, less than excited. He didn't think that the women were ready to fly, and he was skeptical of the training that they had received and required them to conduct even more training under his personal supervision before they were allowed to fly. While under his command, which would be, for as far as I'm aware, the entire war, he would frequently refer to the women as princesses. He also was a little skeptical because, as I said before, night bombers were generally not considered the cream of the crop. This is a little bit of a massive double standard because he's a night bomber guy in charge of a night bomber regiment, so what was he expecting? But anyhow, generally, the best pilots got sent to be fighter pilots, and then the next best were sent to be daytime bombers, and then the rest were nighttime bombers. Which you might think, that seems a little bit weird. Isn't flying at night harder? Yes, but let me break it down. You'll see this actually makes a little bit of sense. Yes, flying at night is much harder, and as such, a more skilled pilot would make more sense to do it, but nighttime missions tended to be less dangerous. At least from the kind of, getting shot down aspect. It's the 1940s, and the ability to see at night is bad. So, if you're a plane at night, it's easier to not get seen, and as such, it's easier to not get shot down. As well, there was an understanding that accuracy was less important in nighttime bombing missions. No one really expected you to hit anything in the dark. Instead, this wasn't about we're going to blow up arms depot, or we're going to blow up a specific piece of the map. Rather, this was more about just harassing the enemy and not letting them sleep than anything else, really. So, at the end of the day, having a pilot who isn't as good of a flyer makes sense. They're less likely to be shot down, and it's less important that they hit the target. So, you can get away with somebody who's not as good. And speaking of not needing the best pilots, the gear that night bombers would use would usually be considered not the best. The plane that the women of the 588th flew was the Polikarpov PO-2. This was an open cockpit biplane that absolutely fucking sucked. This was straight up a World War I biplane that was used for training. These were the kinds of planes that the women trained with in the civilian air clubs. The thing was incredibly slow, had no armor shielding on either the fuselage or where the crew stayed, and couldn't climb to the normal heights of a normal plane. The PO-2 could only fly at about a speed of 60 miles an hour and could only be used at a height of 5,000 feet. For comparison, a modern, for the time anyways, Soviet bomber could fly at speeds of well over 200 miles an hour and could fly at heights of tens of thousands of feet. As well, these planes were not tough. As I said before, they had no armor shielding. And instead of being made of, metal? No, these were made of wood and canvas. Again, these are straight up planes that would have fit in World War I. And since they were made out of wood and canvas, they couldn't hold a whole lot of weight. So that meant that their payload had to be severely limited. When you think of a bomber in World War II, you're probably thinking of a plane unloading dozens of large bombs out the bomb bay doors. Well, the PO-2 could manage about 5 bombs. Depending on the weight of the people in the plane, you could have as few as 4 or as many as 6. And these weren't big bombs either. These aren't, 500-pound bombs. These are the kinds of bombs that somebody could probably pick up and drop on their own if they were so inclined. And the bombs were all you had. The plane was so light duty that it had no other offensive
or defensive weapons, and didn't even have enough room for parachutes for the crew. A crew that was 2 people. The 588th would be stuck with the PO2 the entire war. They were a night bomber detachment, and an all-women's one at that. Despite their constant requests for more modern airplanes, they were never given them. So, even though the PO2 kinda really sucked, there was a war to fight, and this is what the ladies of the 588th were given to fight it. So goddamn it, they were gonna do it. In 1942, the 588th and their coterie of practically antique airplanes set off to help defend the city of Stalingrad. This would be their first time in combat, and everyone was watching. The male pilots and crew that served in the other divisions constantly harassed them both in the air and on the ground. As well, their male superior officers had little to no faith in them. As well, outside of the blatant sexism that was going on, the Battle of Stalingrad was a titular moment in the war, and it was pretty clear to everyone involved that if the Soviet Union lost here, if the Red Army couldn't hold, this could very well be it for the whole Soviet Union. Not just the war, but the whole place in general. In other words, the pressure on the 588th was tense. As night bombers, the 588th's job was to harass supply lines ferrying supplies to the front under the cover of darkness. So, the women set out on their first mission in the June of 1942 to do just that. The women took off for their first mission little after sundown over the Taman Peninsula. It would be here that they took their first casualties. One plane went missing. Only after the war did the Red Army and the ladies of the 588th learn that the plane had in fact been shot down and that the bodies of the crew had been buried by locals in the region. In spite of their initial losses, the 588th's mission was successful, and they quickly found themselves settling into a breakneck mission schedule. You see, the beauty of these beat-up, barely working, slow-as-fuck PO2s was that they needed to be really close to the front lines in order to actually make it to the target and back. Like, at all. They didn't have the speed or the range to be stationed anywhere other than basically right where the combat was happening. So, this meant that the women could quickly make their attack run and then return to the base, be refueled, repaired, and rearmed, and then go back at it. The women were so close to the front line that each minute only took about 45 minutes from takeoff to touchdown. As well, since the planes carried little fuel and were lightly loaded, they could be refueled and rearmed in about 5 minutes. As well, their bombing runs almost never had fighter escorts. So, as soon as the bombers were ready to lift off, they were able to take off and go ahead and just go right back into the fray. As such, each plane could make about 6 flights a night, a pace the 588th was dedicated to keep up. To keep this pace, the pilot would fly out to the mission area while the navigator slept. Then for the actual bombing part, both of them would be awake. Then, after the bombing run, the navigator would fly while the pilot slept. This not only meant that the flyers could get sleep, but also that the navigator could get experience flying in case something were to ever happen to the pilot. After 8 months of this absolutely insane schedule, it was clear that the women of the 588th were first-class pilots, and the Red Army gave them a huge commendation. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was now going to be designated the 46th Taman Guards Regiment. For those of you who don't know, a Guards Regiment in the Soviet Union is basically a unit that has been distinguished as an elite unit. They're generally awarded better equipment and are treated better by military high command. To be designated as a Guards unit is a huge honor. Once the 588th was designated the 46th Guards Regiment, the men pretty much all but shut up and let the women do their work. But this was not the only name change that the newly minted 46th Guards would be undergoing. You see, the Germans had come up with a name for the women as well. This would be the Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The ladies of the 46th were given this title by the Germans because of the way that they seemed to appear out of nowhere and harass the Germans without so much as a warning. This was because of a special tactic that the women liked to employ. On their approach to the target, the women would cut their engines and glide onto the scene, making almost no noise. This, paired with the fact that the PO2 had to be flown so low to the ground, made the women incredibly difficult to find and very difficult to engage once detected. And even though the PO2 could only hold about 5 bombs, this didn't really matter. Their goal was not to blow up targets necessarily, it was mostly just to sow chaos, keep the worried Germans up at night, and generally bog down the German logistics. And for that, this setup worked perfectly. The ladies could swoop in low and quietly drop their bombs and be back to base just about as fast as anyone could notice. Supposedly, the name Night Witches came from the sound that the planes made when they glided overhead. The planes were described as making a soft swooshing sound, like the sound of wind coming off a witch's broom. After months of fighting, the Night Witches and the rest of the Red Army in Stalingrad would ultimately defeat the Nazis and begin driving them back unyieldingly towards Berlin. The Night Witches would be along for the entire war. Throughout the war, the 46th Taman Guards Regiment would fly 24,000 missions. As far as I am aware, that is the most any regiment in any army has ever flown. And 23 of their members would be made heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest military and civilian honor in the USSR. But in spite of the effectiveness of the 46th, as well as the other women's regiments who did show pretty serious valiance, and one of which was also made a guards unit, the women's air regiments would be disbanded after the war. But in spite of this, the Night Witches and the other women's regiments marked an important milestone. These would be the very first women to ever openly fly in combat missions. In the US, there were non-combat flying roles for women, such as the US Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASPs, who would fly planes in order to test them out or to move them from one place to another. But at the end of the day, there was no other country that fielded women in combat like the USSR. So, to this day, the 46th Guards Regiment, or the Night Witches, is somewhat of a legend, really, within kind of military circles who are not afraid of admitting that women served in the war. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting story that I wanted to share with y'all, and to give you kind of, a little bit of a historical glimpse at something that doesn't really get discussed a whole lot. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you learned something new here today. If you did, or really even if you didn't, please do not hesitate to leave me a review on whatever platform it is that you listen on, as your feedback helps me make the show better. I have not been updating Instagram a lot lately, or really updating anything lately, so sorry about that. But if you do want to follow the show, you can at BTRSPod over on Instagram. But for now, I would like to thank you all again for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.